Hi everyone, welcome to the second hatch video. This is how to use hatches in Illustrator. So we did this in the previous video with Rhino. So these are the hatches that we brought in from Rhino. And I'm just going to quickly show you how to use hatches in Illustrator. So to do this, I'm just going to use um, the Illustrator drawing tools rather than exporting from Rhino because it's a bit cumbersome to show you in this video. But it works the same way if you export your line work from Rhino. So the first thing I'm going to do just really quickly is create a new layer in Illustrator and lock my previous layers. And I'm going to call this layer Illustrator Hatch, just for simplicity. So the first thing I want to do is just create a rectangle in Illustrator. So to do that, I just select the rectangle tool on the panel. We always advise not drawing in Illustrator, but this is just a demonstration video. So it's the exact same if I brought in a square from Rhino to Illustrator. So nothing different there. But try not to draw in Illustrator because Rhino's a much better drawing tool. So if I've got a square in Illustrator, I can actually give it a fill in Illustrator without needing to hatch it in Rhino first. So this is something that you can do in Illustrator, which is quite useful. So down here in the bottom left corner, you can see two squares. There's one square, and if you hover over it, it says stroke, and the other one says fill. So this indicates the color of the stroke and the fill of an object. So if I select this object, you can see that the stroke has got a black outline there because my stroke on this square is black. So if I double click on that, it brings up the text color box. And if I change that to sort of a bright red, you can see that the stroke there on the outside becomes red. And if I click away, the stroke on the square is red. If I click on the box that's behind my stroke box, if I click here, you can see they actually change which is in front or which is behind. So if I click there, the stroke will become in front, and if I click back on the fill square will become on top then. If I double click on that, it opens up another color box. So this is how you edit the color of the fill. So let's say I'm going to make this blue. Whoops, I didn't select the object first. So let's select that object again, double click on the fill box, change that to blue, go OK. Now the fill of my square is blue and the stroke is red. So that's the basics of sort of editing fill colors and stroke colors of closed objects in Illustrator, which you may have already discovered, you may not, either way, it's good to know. So just to make that a bit more clear, I'm going to select my box and I'm just going to change the stroke size to 2 points. And you can see that really clearly, the stroke is red and the fill is blue. A little pro tip, this is probably too much detail, is I can actually select that square and I can, on my keyboard, hold Shift and then the letter X, Shift X, and that'll invert the fill and stroke colors. So I can hit X, 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 Shift X, and it will change the colors and invert them. Sorry, that was probably a bit of a strobe light warning there. Then I can also delete those colors. So if I go back down to if I select my square and I go back down to my little colors here, I can hit the little non line strike through box there and it will remove whatever color I put there. You can do the same for the stroke. Select it and you can remove the color. So I'm just going to undo what I just did, so backspace, and I've got my square. So let's add a hatch to this square. It's a little fiddly, but it's quite easy once you get used to the method. So I'm going to select the box that I've created and go over to these colors up here. So these are also the stroke colors. However, editing them up here gives you a few more options than just here. So just down here, you can only edit the colors and the order of which they appear on the box, whereas up here, you can edit them to be more interesting. So if I select the little down arrow on so this is the fill box and this is the stroke box. They're the same symbols as down here. So fill and stroke. If I select the down arrow on the fill box, I get this little empty box here. This is where all your swatches and preset colors go if you've got them. That's a little bit more advanced, and we can go into that another time. So this little dialog box opens, and just down here, there's like this little library symbol of like books like stacked up against each other. If you select that, you get all these different options for adding kind of interesting fills to your square. For this, we want to go down to patterns. Then from patterns, we want to open up a new dialog box and go to basic graphics. And you can open up any one of these that you want. For the sake of this video, I'm going to open up textures just because they're interesting. So just to go over that again, go up to the top here, top left-hand corner, select the down arrow on the fill box, go down to the bottom left corner of that dialog box and open up the libraries menu, go down to patterns, then go to basic graphics, then go to basic graphics textures. Click on that, and this dialog box will open. So this is a set of preset textures you can use in Illustrator. And we can start to apply these to our square. So the first thing to do is to just deselect everything. Select the square and make sure back down here that the fill box is on top of the stroke box. That means that we're editing the fill of our shape, not the stroke. So just again, select the box and make sure that the fill box is on top. Once you've done that, you go back over to your textures box and I can select a texture and it will change the fill of my square to a fun kind of preset texture in Illustrator. So you can select all different kinds of textures here. There's lots of different kinds. They're all a little bit fun and interesting. So have a cycle through these and see which of these you like. There's some quite good ones. So let's just select sort of something simple, the squiggly line one for now. We can edit this fill in Illustrator as well. So in the same way that we can resize and rotate the hatch in Rhino, we can do the same thing in Illustrator, but it's just slightly less intuitive. This is why we draw in Rhino and not Illustrator, but it's worth showing you this technique as well. So if you want to resize or scale or change the size of the hatch in Illustrator, you can select the square, the object that you want to change the hatch size of. So select the square, right click and go down to transform. Then go to scale. So just go over that again, select the square, right click, go down to transform, and then go down to scale. Select scale and it'll open up this dialog box. Now, this is really important which settings you put in, otherwise it'll change the object in the wrong way. So we want to leave the uniform button ticked and just leave that as our 100%. That's not important for now. The most important thing is to go down to here and untick transform objects. If we leave that ticked, it'll scale the entire object, but we just want to scale the pattern on the inside. So we want to untick transform objects and leave transform patterns ticked. The default setting, I believe, is to have just transform objects ticked. So make sure you tick transform patterns and untick transform objects. So it looks like this. These two, just leave them unticked, that's fine. And just for fun, let's tick preview. Now let's go back up to here and we can change the scale percentage. So if we want to make it smaller, we need to go and put in a number that's less than 100. And if we want to make it larger, we need to put in a number that's greater than 100. So I want to make it smaller, so I'm going to put in 50%. That means that it'll scale that by half. So if I click away, this is always a bit fiddly. There we go. You need to kind of click something else so that it kind of registers in preview. So it's really frustrating. But there you go. You can see that the pattern has become scaled by half. If I type in 25 and sort of preview or something, it scales again by half. And you can go all the way down to sort of really, really fine percentages to make it really, really fine. The smaller you go, though, the more it looks like just a grey color, and you can actually see that the texture has been tiled in these little squares, and it kind of just repeats. So I think sometimes larger textures actually look a bit better. There we go. Once you're happy with the texture, you can go OK. And now you've got kind of a texture for your color in Illustrator. You can do more interesting things, like you can go to transform and you can go to rotate. And it's essentially the same dialog box. So just make sure that transform patterns is ticked, and then we can actually rotate the object. It's quite hard to tell with this texture because it's squiggly lines, but you can rotate the pattern as well, so long as you don't tick transform objects. If you do tick transform objects, you can see that the entire object rotates. So you can also rotate objects if you want to, but otherwise just untick that and just transform the pattern. Go OK. Good. Now let's just remove the outside line. So go down to the stroke and hit none, and that'll remove the stroke outline of the object. So now it's just a texture. You can go and you can sort of change the opacity of this as well, like we did in the last video with those lines. So select the object, go up to the top here where it says opacity, and you can sort of drag that down and change the opacity. Then you can start to add more objects and textures on top. So I just made my own mistake. If you've selected a new square and you've got the stroke setting ticked on top, and I add a texture, it'll actually add a texture to the stroke, and it looks really weird. So just go none on that. Make sure the fill is on top, then you can change the pattern. And I'm just creating a bunch of squares. I'm just going to give them all different textures. And you can start to kind of, you know, do the same thing on Illustrator that you do on Rhino. So they look very similar, but there's just kind of a slightly different variety of hatches and things to use in Illustrator. It's important to note that all the teaching staff are really familiar with all of these basic graphics textures. So we won't be, super impressed by any of these textures because we know what they are. So what is typically more interesting for us is if you start to, use these textures in interesting ways by making them really finely detailed. So if they're kind of harder to tell what they are, it's kind of more interesting for us. And if you start to overlap them, it's kind of harder to tell what those textures actually are. You can also add sort of more things to this box if you go over to Fill, Libraries, Patterns, Basic Graphics. And so we ticked textures last time, but you can do things like lines, and you can add sort of a series of kind of interesting lines. And there's a few preset sort of line weight thicknesses there and sort of shapes and objects. So there's heaps for you to play with. So hopefully that helps. There's two slightly different methods for using hatches in Rhino and Illustrator, and using them both to great effect is quite interesting. And otherwise, just choose your preferred method and go with that. Hopefully that helped, and I'll see you in the next video. Thanks.